What's up, everybody? Today I have invited Ross Byrd back to practice some conversation craft here with me in the Yours Truly virtual studio. I last conversed with Ross back in May, reaching out to him after Jordan Hall left his name as an Easter egg at the end of his Randos conversation with Paul Vanderklay. Ross is a teacher, theologian, surfer from the East Coast, and could easily be described as the Patrick Swayze of this little corner of the internet. In our last conversation, we discussed his writing and work, which he's published over on his Substack, Patient Kingdom. Head over there after today's conversation and become a subscriber and check out some of his work. Link will be in the description. But first, if you'd like to support this channel, give it a like and subscribe. If it makes sense, share it with friends. And if you believe yours truly is something that might be described as worth your while, you can support the channel financially by becoming a channel member. So check that out. Link will also be in the description. In our last conversation, Ross and I discussed some of his written work dealing with the tension between inclusion and holiness, exploring how they sometimes pull in different directions. He uses examples from scripture such as Peter's vision in Acts and Joseph's story in Genesis to illustrate moments where inclusion overrides traditional notions of holiness and vice versa. We also discussed his role of priests, or the role of priests in spiritual leadership, contrasting the modern evangelical flattening of pastoral roles with the deeper sense of a formal priesthood and sacredness. We emphasized that priests and pastors should be set apart, leading by trustworthy example, guiding communities in worship and representing holiness. We critiqued how contemporary churches often lack a certain fleshed out hierarchy, leading to more ambiguous spiritual experiences, especially in things like small group settings. And further discussed how modern pastors often downplay their spiritual authority when convenient, presenting themselves as equals rather than spiritual leaders who embody and guard sacredness. I'm just a sinner saved by grace, just like the rest of you. Today, we're going to go further in that conversation related to pastoral office, how flattening leads to a type of nihilistic piety, and ask the question, what really is a fall from grace? All of this in the context of a recent piece he wrote over on Patient Kingdom entitled, There for the Grace of God on Moral Failings, a saying we should maybe quit saying, where he gives a perspective on the rise, failing, and rising again of former Hillsong megachurch pastor Carl Lentz after Lentz's private sins of infidelity became public. This conversation also holds the context for myself, having been on staff as a pastor and having my own failure of fidelity to God, my marriage, and my family and my church. How we talk about sin to ourselves, to each other, and to our churches, and how we choose to respond to failures of fidelity in our clergy seems to be currently a revolving door of pithy sayings and phrases. Fearing that if we look too closely, we will actually have to deal with the anger, shame, fears, even disgust, before we can skip to the very happy Christian notions of forgiveness and reconciliation. Today's episode will be heavy, and that's okay. Wherever you're at, we invite you to join us in this conversation about a conversation that can be difficult to have. So clock in, start some yard work, hit the road, put the kid down for a nap, and join Ross and I today thinking out loud about failure, grace, and pastors as we practice some conversation craft here on the Yours Truly podcast. So without any further delay, I give you Ross Byrd. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. And he's the person I think that loves me the most.
Wow.
And this was in that journey, that in between that week or two. And he said, if you choose the path of repentance, it's going to be like crawling over jagged glass. And it was, and it is.
I'm sure that was prophetic.
Yeah. And we didn't really talk. There were different reasons about why we didn't talk, but it wasn't because I wasn't angry at him. I loved him dearly for telling me that. I had all these people coming up to me brother, it could have been me. And,
There, but for the grace of God go I.
I don't believe that because it's not you unless it has been you. And so I, or just making light of not making light, but like kind of bypassing the reality, just like, bat packing. I'm like, you don't pat the back of somebody that's done this. You don't pat the back of a betrayer. He deserves a little bit of shame. Or a lot, actually. And so he was one of the only people that told me the truth in that way. There were other people that told me the truth. I needed friends. I needed people to come around me. So it's not a complete like, oh, don't love me. I needed people to love me. But like, so that journey that you're talking about, turning towards God, and what the experience that you had today, like there's the old sermon illustration. You may have even given it about the guy, the family on the top of the roof. So Ross, hey man.
Hey.
That's the clip I sent you after reading your article or your Substack there, but for the grace of God, on moral failings, a saying we should maybe quit saying. Yeah, man. So that's why I reached out to you again and thought we could have a conversation on that.
That was powerful to listen to. It's this is a heavy topic. I'm glad to be here to talk with you about it.
Yeah, man. So for people that don't maybe know the backstory, or you wrote an article about Carl Lentz, who, and I said this in the intro, he was a very famous evangelical mega church pastor connected to Hillsong out of New York City. He was friends with like Justin Bieber and NBA players, and then there comes this public story about infidelity in his marriage, and recently he has started a podcast, and that was like 4 years ago. And he's on there with his wife, and they're talking about healing, and he's had other conversations with people like his therapist and other things. So how closely have you been kind of paying attention, or what's the context for what made you first want to, there would have to be something bubbling up inside of you to want to write about it?
Yeah, I haven't been paying that close attention lately to Carl Lentz, and the piece wasn't meant to even really be about him when I started writing it. I think it was probably the Steve Lawson scandal that brought it back to my mind. But honestly, I think I wrote in the beginning of the piece, it's such a revolving door of scandals these days, just partially because we have so much access to famous pastors and teachers that it seems like an almost weekly or monthly event that someone who has had some spiritual influence to you, whether you've read great books by them or listened to sermons by them for years, or they actually had some more personal pastoral influence in your life, it ends up becoming some kind of breaking news that there was more going on privately for that person. Okay. So yeah, I think Steve Lawson, I guess, was the latest that struck me, and I didn't have great familiarity with his teaching, but a number of my friends did, and at the same time, maybe coincidentally, someone brought my attention to the Lentz's podcast, and we have some personal connections with the Lentz family, which is another reason that it was uncomfortable writing, uncomfortable to think about, because it was close to home for us. The Lentz's are from Virginia Beach, and so I had no intention to sort of besmirch their family name in what I was writing, but what Carl was talking about more publicly, I think it's fair game to talk about, and so it was no judgment on how he's doing now or any of that, but more on how we deal with these kinds of scandals and the fallout and recovery. And it seems like we're doing that live. It seems like it continues to happen for our evangelical communities. And I'm not sure we've found the best way, but if that probably goes deeper into, I'm not sure we've really found the best way to define the roles of our spiritual leaders, what their roles actually are in our lives. And so it's a complicated discussion to have, but that's how it came to me. And that's why I wrote about it. You and I actually talked about it a little bit at the end of our conversation last time. So maybe that's why.
Yeah, we did. And, I'm just sitting here going through the list in my mind of, in the last, I mean, in my own life, 7 to 8 years of like, there was Ravi Zacharias that came out. Carl Lentz was 4 years ago. There's this little weirdly discussed issue with Matt Chandler and instant messaging, and then the pastor at it's another church in Texas, the charismatic church, no, not Bethel. There's a lot. I mean, there's then the guy Bill Hybels from Willow Creek. Trying to think of the church. They have like a Gateway in Texas. That pastor recently, I mean, very recently, he's been fired. This other pastor that you mentioned from the Texas area, and I think it's easy to like, oh, the mega church. I didn't go to a mega church. You talk about a situation in your life in the article, with a youth pastor, and so, I mean, it's easy to kind of, like I said, to kind of point at the public, the big kind of cover story. Oh, there's even Austin Stone, Aaron Ivey. I don't know if you know that story as well.
No.
He was a worship leader down there. His wife had a podcast called The Happy Hour, I think. Yeah, there's just, I mean, like I said, there's a lot, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of good answers. And I do think that my opinion on Carl Lentz is that I think what he's doing and with his wife, and my wife and I have like watched their story on Instagram over the last 4 or 5 years pretty closely, and appreciate how they're dealing with some of it, or a lot of it actually. But so that's like, the framework, more specifically, but I guess, so I had, back months ago in that conversation with Zach Parsons said, I don't like that phrase there, but for the grace of God go I. So as soon as that your Substack dropped, and I was like, oh man, could you kind of walk through that article and kind of hit the high points of, and we'll kind of discuss it as we go.
Yeah. So I started out just by saying that we're living in a moment where we're seemingly barraged with this feeling, and to some degree it can be indirect, and sometimes it's more direct, of spiritual betrayal by those that we counted on to lead us and to be trustworthy. And so there's a tendency a temptation, let's say, to become cynical about that. And there are certain aspects of, let's say, just good Orthodox Christian doctrine that could almost help you become more cynical if you treated them subtly the wrong way. Like, let's say, our doctrine of sin. When the next scandal breaks, the people who are counting on that person can be devastated and shocked. But then you could, kind of fall back into your theological armchair and say, well, total depravity, or this is kind of what we've always believed about sin. We shouldn't even really be surprised when these kinds of things happen. And people in my life say those things,
Yes.
And I understand why they say those things. I mean, gosh, read the Bible. The people that were most counted on were doing some of the most heinous things at some of the times when they were the most counted on, like David. And so it's not as though we are surprised, I guess, in the abstract. But there is a danger that comes with that kind of cynicism, or I guess they would call it realism, not cynicism, but there's a danger with it, which is that you can abstract sin to a degree to which it's a more powerful than grace. The power of sin is more powerful than the power of God and the grace of God, and you can make it into a kind of moral resignation that allows you to dismantle your own personal agency, and allows you to believe that there's actually really no such thing or no such possibility as holiness and redemption and trustworthiness. And so that's my concern. And about the phrase "there, but for the grace of God, go I." I think it comes actually from a good place. I think I mentioned in the article, I think most of the ways that people use it, or maybe have classically used it, are good. They either mean "there, but for the grace of God would have gone I," in a time before I've seen this transformation in my life that makes such failures not plausible. Or it could be even more humble and lowly than that, and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm doing in my heart what this person has done with their body. So I repent. Like I could, I must change now," which is a very humble way of using it. But again, there is the kind of the armchair theologian way of saying that phrase, which is basically like anybody could do that thing at any time, and any Christian leader could have just as well have done that. Almost like it's just a roll of the dice, who does and who doesn't. And I think that demeans the grace of God to be something like a good luck charm that I'm glad that is working for me when it wasn't working for so and so. And that's very dangerous. It's very, very dangerous.
It is. I've called it. I think that it's a type of nihilism, and you kind of talked around that a little bit. I had a conversation with Luke Thompson about that months ago, where like the way we armchair total depravity, like you said, is it can easily turn into a type of nihilism. And so I think that there is and that the other piece that you talked about, where on one hand you have this initial true emotional reaction or spiritual reaction to, say, a betrayal of spiritual trust by a leader, and then you have to kind of shut that down and create a cognitive dissonance that, oh, well, I shouldn't be shocked by this because we're all sinners. It's like, you shouldn't be shocked. And that was that was the thing that kind of, on a personal experience, I was like, so I didn't, this sounds prideful, but it's like, I didn't mean, or that job didn't mean anything. It was completely,
That's right.
It was
It's
completely
the meaning of
just,
every role, as though roles don't mean anything. We were never actually counting on you to be authority, to be faithful, to be true to the things that you said, to have any form of integrity.
And that was very difficult for me to begin to think about, in regards to my own failure and my own infidelity, as a pastor, and as a pastor specifically, obviously as a husband, but as a pastor, it was kind of like there was like this weird backpacking, and in your article, you talk about accountability groups. So kind of go into that section related.
Yeah, I don't know if I talked about it in the article. Oh yes, you're right. I did a little bit in the article and a little bit in the comments, because
That's
the most comments I've ever had on an article, which I was surprising, and I almost felt bad about, because it was like, I don't know if it was attracting
clickbait,
scandal or something, but it had turned out, thankfully, that the comments were very sincere and
substantive.
Mostly it's just because so many people are and have been affected by the sort of thing that we're talking about right now. So in the end, it was good, but I was a little bit concerned at first. Accountability groups, man. It's another hard thing to talk about. It's, we tend to, and I guess I should clarify that a lot of what I wrote in the article has to do with people that have some form of authority, right? So everything that we're saying right now, it applies a little bit differently if you're a 16-year-old that's just trying to figure out who you are as a Christian man. But
that's kind of the point.
Yeah, It is.
That's kind of the point, is that we're treating everybody like 16-year-olds.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a way, there's a sermon I feel like that needs to be given to the to the modern church, which is something like, the stronger brother is still like good, like there's a lot of teaching in Paul, notions about the weaker brother and making sure that we're deferring to the weaker brother, which is exactly right. And we fail to do it on any number of levels, and scandalize people because of that. But there's another kind of scandal, which is to forget that the stronger in the faith is still what we should all be trying to be, right? Where we actually take the weaker brother, lower ourselves in a sense, so that the church is accessible to him, but then carry him and walk with him further up the mountain, is something that we haven't done. And so we've ended up demeaning a lot of our Christian messaging to the 16-year-old and not gone beyond that. And so anyway, a lot of what we're talking about now is trying to go beyond that, towards trustworthiness. And so eventually, if you're in an accountability group of 30, 40-year-old, 50-year-old men who are leaders in their businesses, or leaders in their churches, or at least leaders in their families, and you're continuing a kind of pattern of, yes, I struggle with this. Oh, brother, you're forgiven. And then, the other person says, I'm still struggling with this too. There's a kind of fiction that's playing itself out there, like that the only thing that really matters is your private personal piety. And that's kind of what we're there for, is you have your individual personal piety and you have your individual personal piety. And we've forgotten entirely that you are actually needed by other people to be a certain kind of person, And so I think accountability groups would work much better if we started by surrounding ourselves with the people who actually need us to be people who are trustworthy, and whose yes is yes and whose no is no. And then we might feel the consequences a bit more when we make ourselves quote unquote accountable. But as long as the project is just a project of, private personal piety, and we're not considering what roles we have to play in other people's lives, that people outside that private room where we say like, yes, you're forgiven, like, thank you for the grace of God, are actually counting on us to be people who are more than just, personally growing, but who are outwardly and constantly the people who we seem to be.
The part that makes me think about is, this idea of what does it mean to confess your sins? You're in some of those circumstances, you're actually not taking responsibility for your sin.
Yeah.
You're not confessing it. These aren't actually, in some of those contexts, people that you've sinned against.
That's right. That's part of.
But there's this idea that, well, I've talked about it. I've admitted how lowly I am, and then I'm gonna go on and try to be better. But the problem is, no one wants to really tell the person that they've sinned against, which is maybe their wife. That I've been unfaithful in this way. Because that's a much harder conversation to have, and that's for obvious reasons. And I think that is, that's not there. Like, again, there's this weird flattening of, like, there's no hierarchy of, like, well, who have I? Well, I've sinned against God. I've only sinned against God. Which is, kind of there's certain, like, Reformed confessions that kind of will say that. And I remember going back into church and reciting some confessions and kind of having some dissonance. And I think that there is a place for that recognition, like that for that reality, and maybe in like a corporate setting. But if it's like an on or off switch. It's like, I've only sinned against God, or I haven't sinned against any, and then so. But again, like, that's like a flattening binary type situation where there's within that. In the relationships in our life, like, wrong we have done is not only to the fact that we have sinned against the holy creator God, but
Which should be the most frightening thing. Sinning against God should be the most frightening of all, not the least frightening. It should be more frightening than sinning against your God.
Well, maybe, but I don't, like, that's an embodied. I mean, I think that's an embodied fear. Like, because
You're right. You're right.
the frightening thing about sin, of confessing that sin to your wife, is not that maybe that she has some kind of cosmic power over you, but that you have to look at her in the face.
That's right.
And that's more painful than a type of, like long distance, extrapolate out of like this is your life. This is now. And again, even that relationship you might have with people in your accountability group, um, or even with a therapist or something like that. Like, um, I just think there's a real issue with, well, I've told somebody, or I've gotten help, or that, but no, you, in this thing that we're talking about very specifically, like, is that there has been, a betrayal of a type of trust, or yes, cosmically, but also against, if you're, again, the difference between a 16-year-old and a person that's 30 and married, or 50 and married, is that marriage relationship. Um, so I don't know.
And the more people that count on you, the less private your private sin is.
Mm,
So just because you're dealing with something, in the privacy of your own iPhone screen, or
yeah.
bedroom, or whatever, it doesn't mean that that sin itself is private. When you sin in that way privately, the number of people who are counting on you to be the person that you make yourself out to be when you lead and you teach and you are an example, a spiritual example to others, you're sitting against all of those people at that time. Those are all victims of your quote unquote private sin. And so when our methods of confession and accountability are only private, and I understand why they begin privately, because sometimes that's the only way to deal um, with things. But and they used to begin only privately with a spiritual authority, right? With a priest who represents God, who's a kind of mediation to the holiness of God. Um, for us as evangelicals, they usually are more like the therapeutic method, where it's kind of like fully behind a privatized, closed door, confidential relationship that does not involve necessarily a spiritual authority, but only a kind of jury of your peers who are also usually dealing with the exact same thing as you are. And so I don't say that that's bad, but I say that we have to see the danger in that, which is that it's going to, over time, kind of immunize us from seeing the nature of our actual sin, because we're dealing with something that is not really private sin privately. And so we miss the stakes, like you said, of actually having to tell your wife something like that.
Yeah, and what's interesting, like, I was just thinking about, and I don't think it happens like this in, every Catholic context or whatever, but that the confession booth, like, you look over, there's a line of people confessing sin. That's the medium is a message in a way that's like, whoa, you know, it's one thing to confess it together, but it's another thing to see the private confession take place in real time or something like that. Um, Very interesting where you talk about it being behind a closed wall of, like I do sometimes. I do online therapy just like this privately in my house on a computer, like, which I'm not denigrating, but I think
Right.
because the truth is, and I've had conversations on here with specifically with Justin Wells, who he's a filmmaker out in LA, and uh, he's gone back and he's looking at the hero story, but one of the things that he came across, because he has a book called Truth, uh, how you find spiritual truth in documentary filmmaking. He sees how Freud and Jung both wanted to decouple confession from into the seculum from the the sacred,
Yeah.
and as a result, all these things that we're talking about are part of that. Not to say that everything was perfect and fine, in that model.
Right.
Uh,
It clearly wasn't. But once you do that, the short term, you see the power of it, right? You sort of see, wow, like confession is restorative, even in a sort of secular context. But then it also short circuits the power of it, which is, I think, what we're experiencing in some of our accountability groups, which is that we're sort of cheating off of the real power of bringing light to sin, and we're experiencing real power from that, just as someone does in the therapy office. But we're also divorcing it from the stacked context
Mhm.
of all of the the meaning and consequences of our sin, who it has sinned against. Which again, God is not the lowest level of that; He is the highest level. So it's like you actually have to kind of go through your wife and through the congregation that was relying on you and your family and your friends to see that God is sort of the highest and most holy one that you have sinned against. But we miss those stacked levels, and so we get the short term fix. The therapeutic side, let's say, of confessing our sin without the long-term, more powerful and heavy effects of what it is to deal with our sin, and to see what grace really means.
And they're in the question of, like, say you're sitting in a circle doing that, and everybody's basically saying the same thing, and then who is the example? Like, is there an example
Yeah.
of a way forward? Because then it's like, oh, there's this therapeutic confession, but then there's also not an example. But then if you then go to church on Sunday and the pastor says something like, I'm the biggest sinner in this room, which happens all the time in certain contexts. It's like, um, Paul, chief of sinners,
Chief of sinners.
like, and it's like, and then that creates like, well, then where do I look? Like, is there no, well, look to Christ, look to Christ. And I think that's why this, when I talked about, you talked about like the fear of God, but then I was like, well, what was the fear of your wife? Like, but even like, so you like this personal relationship, embodied relationship, but also the embodied relationship to say something like the pastoral the pastoral office, and looking and saying, um, is there hope? Like, that's why I say it seems nihilistic.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. I don't know if there's a way to bring this back to the article with Lentz, like, in kind of what your point was related to that.
Well, I mentioned, actually, just to keep going with what you're saying, that chief of sinners passage is really interesting. In the article, I talked about it a little bit. That when we sort of bandy that term about, we forget that Paul's context there is actually not saying I'm just the chief of sinners, period. That's the end. It's a context of him saying, in a sense, that he has been the chief of sinners, but that God has judged him worthy to give him grace, to make him trustworthy. And he wasn't worthy in and of himself, of course. He was worthy through Christ and through the gift of grace. But the gift of grace, the passage goes on to say, made him trustworthy for the office that he's in. And then he ends up exhorting Timothy, I think it is, to go and do likewise, to not shipwreck your faith, but to live on, persevering in the faith as he has. And so if you read the passage in context, it's simply not a kind of resignation about, I'm the chief of sinners too. It's something like, isn't it amazing how grace transforms us? And so then he ends up saying things like, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And that's something that you don't hear very often from our pulpits. And maybe we would say, well, Paul is a saint and I am not. And that would be valid. I don't know that all of our pastors are saints.
But a lot of our example is, okay, Timothy is the proto example of pastor elder, right? And so, and Paul is his elder and seminarian, like that's the model, right? Like Timothy is a young pastor, and he's trying. So it's like, well, Paul's not only a saint, he was his elder in that way.
Right.
And so, and I think the other thing that you're coming up there with, the work that you come back to, you mentioned trustworthy, and the qualification we talk about. You can. It's funny to just have these conversations. The qualifications of an elder. I've heard these. 2 Timothy, blah, blah, whatever it is, like sermons. But the idea to be trustworthy doesn't seem to necessarily be in the rubric of successful pastor, and I think that's what we're seeing. Like, that's not in the foundational rubric. It's butts and seats and charisma and executive leadership skill.
Yeah.
I don't see that trustworthy part being as high of a priority, because the priority, even in the telos of evangelism, is how effectively can you tell this story? how effectively can you share good news? And I think this is kind of to reference back to our previous conversation about that tension between something like holiness and inclusion is the difference between um, something like gr- spiritual growth versus exponential growth. Like that, there's sometimes that to try to reach people with this story versus how is this story going down and creating change, and that being something that we're helping formation, I guess, isn't the pop word too. But
Yeah, it's sort of transaction versus relationship. God,
yeah.
God is so patient in His
Mm.
redemption of the world, and it may be quite annoying to us that He is. It would seem like to us maybe that it would have been a better path for Him to zap things into order at whatever time that He chose to do so. But that isn't the kind of salvation that He came to bring. And if we look at it closely, it isn't the kind of salvation that we need. We don't have buttons on us that can simply be pressed, or code that can simply be reset. We're people who love, and once we begin to love the wrong things, the way back is a complex road of reshaping and retilling the soil of our hearts so that we can love the right things. And so part of the way that, and it's disturbing that Jesus does it this way, but part of the way He does this is He comes into a world at a time when all the spiritual leaders are failing, right? And so you would think that His own response would be a kind of transactional response in which He says, no more spiritual leaders. Like, I press the button, they're gone. I am now the spiritual leader, and that's the way we're going to do things from now on. You just follow Jesus, and all the sort of intermediary things that you used to count on, like these Pharisees and scribes, they just go bye-bye. But that isn't what He does. Like he calls these 12 to Him and kind of reinstates spiritual authority underneath Himself. And of course, it's importantly underneath Himself, because the Pharisees had lost their way, but He reinstates it in a kind of disturbing way, especially for us Protestants. When He tells Peter, "On this rock I'm going to build the church," and then through the epistles we see the qualifications for elders end up being a very important discussion, meaning they still understand that these intermediary spiritual leaders are central to the growth of people. And one thing that we kind of rediscovered, I think, on this little corner of the internet is that people follow people, not principles. So in some sense, it doesn't matter how good your teaching is from the pulpit. The people are there for you. It's like they're, and so it creates a kind of illusion, like, oh man, this teaching, so like that 3-point sermon, man, that was the thing. But no, Tim Keller was the thing. It wasn't even his 3 points. It was always, this man seems to embody Christ even in the way that he gives his 3-point sermon. The very ethos of that sermon is what people are holding on to, not even the points themselves. You can see this easily. I don't know if you've ever been a part of like a youth ministry like Young Life or something like that. But these kinds of ministries, which I think have had a very powerful effect over the last number of generations, they sometimes do this funny thing where they trick themselves into thinking that they've kind of perfected the message that teenagers need to hear. But it's always been the people. It's just that the 16-year-old sees the 25-year-old and is like, I want to be like that guy, and it's not devoid of the message. Of course, the message is extremely important. I don't mean to say that it's one and not the other, but we have sort of denigrated the extent to which that 16-year-old has really said, I want to be that 25-year-old. And at whatever cost, basically, like, I will follow him. And so if that 25-year-old is trustworthy, then that will be discipleship. That is the way real discipleship works. But it's also the way that discipleship breaks down, because you can't say in the end, if that 25-year-old ends up in some kind of disqualifying sin, well, at least I gave him the 3 points that he needed to know. No, the 3 points start falling apart too, because he was always counting on you, not just the principles.
Well, that makes me think about, because you're flirting with the deconstruction of the Christian faith for young people, right? Like in that.
Yeah.
And I already mentioned the medium is the message. Like when you think that, we're like, well, the message is extrapolated, from the person. Well, here's the gospel story, or here's the good news.
Yeah.
That's not what we find in Christ. Christ was a person, and his disciples were people.
Yes. And salvation is relational.
And so, and you hear that, like, it the message that these people give, like Ravi Zacharias's work, is not devoid of him as the person.
Can't
When
be.
you can't just go back and watch him and think and listen to his apologetic and think, well, at least the apologetic is good as a, it won't be, you cannot extrapolate that. And so to get back to the Carl Lentz, or even just say myself having a podcast on here like this,
Mhm.
like because he's doing that on a much bigger scale. But like, so he is a person with another medium, but I would say he probably is still carrying the same message, it to a degree, like that Christ is the way, like I don't know if you in your article, like I don't know if you kind of left it in kind of a jury's still out on that front for the person.
Yeah, I think my concern and why I invoked Lentz in it, my concern there is that there seems to be a misunderstanding of his role, um, which is an important part of reckoning with how to restore what has been broken. At the end of the article, I say, if you want to rebuild the house, it's kind of a playing off of Jesus' words. If you want to build a tower, then you have to count the cost. If you want to rebuild that tower, then you have to count the cost again, and the cost is going to be greater in the rebuilding than it was in the building in the first place. And so, for those who have had a certain role in people's lives, and your role was important, but it was not to the same extent as his, and so it will look different. Um, the rebuilding has to happen according to that role. There's a lot to restore besides sort of like your own family, let's say, as we were talking about, and this works for you too, not just against you. Like if you're always thinking like, oh, how do I be personally restored? There's actually not enough reason there for even you to be personally restored. We are kind of like I've been saying this whole time. We are people who are not just individuals, but are interwoven with everyone else in our lives. And that interwovenness, of course, breaks everything when we fail. But it's also the very incentive and means by which we can really rebuild. So sorry if this takes us on a bit of a tangent, but like a way that I've seen accountability really work is in hopefully this is appropriate to talk about in the summer camp that I run. So I employ a bunch of young college students, and they are in charge of being leaders of middle school and high school kids who we're teaching to serve. And it's an overnight experience. And so it's just a holistic, like really needs to be trust and trustworthiness together in that place, right? Where we're living together, we're doing everything together, waking up, going to sleep, eating all our meals together for a week at a time. People who come from all over the country and the world, whose parents have entrusted these kids to us. And many of the people that they've entrusted them to are not just me, they have done it to me, but also to these, let's say, 20-year-old men. And I'm not naive. So I know that when I hire a 20-year-old man, even if he's a strong believer, which most of our staff are, they have struggles. And so when they come into, my world, before they ever meet any teenagers, my way of going about it is I basically say, look, I know what you might be coming in here with. You could be struggling with pornography or something like that. But the way that you're going to deal with it here is going to be way different than you've ever dealt with it before, because I can't allow you to have any secrets in this place. Like what do you think you're going to do? Just spend all day taking care of, girls with bathing suits on going in and out of the water. And then at night, you're going to just have your own private, thing where you struggle with this. It won't happen. It cannot happen here. I need you to be a different kind of person here. It won't work otherwise. And you might not see how those two things are totally related at first, though I think you do. I think you do see how they're related, but you can't even come close to having those secrets in this place. And that doesn't mean you can't still have struggles or that I, expect you to be perfect, but I do expect you to be able to fill this role and to be trustworthy in this role. Otherwise, you need to go home now. There's not
That
really an option.
That's great. I think that's awesome. And you hit on like the relativation of sin, but also to the point, and I wanted to bring this back in, is you talk about like this idea that when we do something, say, like at night by ourselves, that we're not at night by ourselves. It's not even just us and God. It's you and the camp. It's you and the campers. It's you and Ross. It's you and the other people. Like we live in this idea, this fantasy that we are alone, like that we are meat bags in like
Yeah.
bumping into people, but that's not like what you're saying. Like there's a real and there's a true connection between it all.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And the crazy
and
thing about it is, like, it works. It actually works
yes,
because
it does.
that's what men have been longing for all along. Is like for someone to, like to use a cliche example, for some like general to just say like we're marching this way, and then they're like, okay, we're marching that way. Like they'll, as long as they know that they are a part of some purpose that's
Yeah.
bigger than them, and that they're needed to go in that direction. I mean, really think it is a cliche, but really think about war. Like, how does any war end up with, especially in more ancient times, 16-year-olds running in the direction of the battle rather than just all of them running away from it? How does that happen? It's because it actually doesn't take that much to make a man feel needed. Like he will actually die for you if he knows that he's needed there. If he knows that it actually matters. It isn't like, oh, this will be good for your personal piety, if you run in the direction of your enemies. No, it's he's finally found a purpose. He's found a reason to actually be the courageous person that he always wished he was. And was he courageous before that moment? Probably not. He was probably afraid, just like everyone else. But when the moment comes, when it really matters, if he just has someone who's usually, to get back to what you were saying to begin with, a general who is running in that direction already, someone that they can look at and see, I see that man is brave. I can be brave too. But of course, if the general's not, if it's only modern warfare where the general's, in some back room and saying, you guys go out and, fight there, I'm sure it'll work out, then we shouldn't be surprised when we see courage fail.
And perverted forms of courage be successful. So I would say, and I think to that point, like the images that were going through my mind are, 25-year-old movies now of the Patriot and the Gladiator, of these singular figures, like in, the or Braveheart, Mel Gibson, multiple movies where you have the one man, like, and there's a specific scene in Braveheart, in the Patriot, where everyone's retreating and he picks up the flag and he runs.
Yeah.
He says, "Hold the line," and I'm just getting chills thinking about it. Or I saw just even a recent reel of that short monologue of Russell Crowe. He takes his mask off. He's like, "I'm I'm the son of the general of the armies of this." It's like, wow. And who would not want to just like
It's what we're longing for.
these characters, and then to make the more real life examples, for me, is flawed as they aren't, movie characters, but Jordan Peterson represented a form of courage on the digital space that people, it's like, what is he's just, enabling a toxic masculinity and blah, 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 whatever. It's like, you don't have no idea. You have no idea. And then, there's obviously the way things go, what does President Trump represent, and the way that why the divergence between men and women politically right now is like going like this.
Yeah.
And it's not, like I said, perverted forms of what courage looks like. It's like, we could go on a whole tangent about that. We don't have to, but I just to your point though, is those two things for a young man to have Ross Byrd look at them before Christian surf camp for the summer and say, I'm going to talk about the things, I worked 10 years of church camp. Like I did every summer for 10 years. I was on staff leading worship for a organization. And, I think in sometimes that question might've been broached in a certain kind of way, but like not with the kind of levity, or not levity, not with the kind of seriousness that it sounds like, that you sit down and look somebody in the eye. And we talk about this as being something akin to life or death, your life or death versus you having this summer or not, or this being a good summer or not, and,
And I mean it 100%. Like, it's not an act, you know? And
No.
I think that's what you want life to be like. You know, you don't, it's not just about personal piety. It's about surrounding yourself with people that you count on and who count on you, and that you kind of fall or rise together. You're trying to climb a mountain that's not easy to climb. I'm not saying any of this is easy, but there's a way of struggling with sin which so disintegrates you that it actually keeps you from even trying to climb. You know, there's two ways of talking about struggle. One is like the struggle to climb the mountain. The other is like the kind of struggle that keeps you from wondering if it's even worth climbing the mountain. And pornography oftentimes is that type of thing. It's so disintegrating that it makes you just like wonder what you're even doing here, you know, like on this earth. And then it, of course, that's how it branches out into other forms of sexual unfaithfulness, because if you're already compromised. Like you already don't even know if the mountain was worth struggling to climb in the first place, because you're still in the struggle of of something like nihilism, you know. And so I think that's where we're leading each other when we're not honest about the stakes of these conversations about, you know, quote unquote personal and private sin. The stakes are high, and so we do each other better favors, I think, to make the stakes high with one another. Maybe even to have the kind of accountability groups where we just actually get upset with each other. I needed you for this reason, you know. Make your similar to what happens with me in our camp. I'm going to be upset, you know, if I find that someone has secrets that I didn't know about in a context where I was counting on them to be forthright with me. It's not just going to be like, oh, you know, you're forgiven, we can move on. Of course I can forgive, and of course we can move on. But it's good. There's going to be stakes, man. Like, it's going to be hard, you know. Yeah.
And what does it mean to be a whole person? Because we're talking about secrets, you know, like, and disintegrated. You know, like, to not be whole. What does it mean to be true, like a true person and a truthful person? Like, does it mean to be full of truth, to be holy? You know, these words are not like, but and it's weird because I think that, like, you've kind of made this distinction between piety versus this, and I don't know if we want to draw that out a little bit more, but also getting to that point. Maybe I think one of the things that was provocative, or at least, and probably was purposely trying to be provocative, from Carl Lentz, is when he talked about, uh, you know, this pastor, he fell from grace, and even like the term moral failure being attached, like that. This is the only point of failure, not down here, not like
That's
it's
right.
oh, it's when that's now
right.
you have committed moral failure. And so I don't know. There's kind of a couple ideas there.
Yeah, I think that's part of the trouble with it's part of the trouble with the way that we're dealing with these breaches of trust among men, especially, is that when we treat it on just the moral level, then you can sort of say like, okay, well, you know, you've made this moral failure, but you can be forgiven and you can move on. But moral, you know, I kind of get this from Jonathan Pageau, but the moral level is not the only level that's going. In fact, it's a very low level. You know, most of the Bible is just not about the moral level at all. The moral level is almost like what you teach. It's almost like teaching your kids, like, don't touch the stove or something like that. Like, it's bad to touch the stove, but they don't even know why it's bad to touch the stove. And eventually they can learn why it's bad to touch the stove. And then eventually they can learn even context in which you might want to touch the stove. But that's the beginning of the problem. So I actually end the article by saying, when these breaches of trust happen, when we are in places where we're counted on, not just pastors, and this is important to know, right? We're not just talking about pastors here, but any father or mother or leader who has any kind of spiritual mantle whatsoever, even if it's just over their own kids, or in their own household, when they fall into this kind of deep sin that we're talking about, it's not just a moral failure, it's a relational failure, and it's a spiritual failure. It's a failure that breaks other people. So to get into the example of my youth pastor when I was 18, when he, and maybe we talked about this a little bit before, but when it came out that he had abused one of my close friends, my wife's best friend at the time. It was obviously very shocking because this man had a really good effect on my life. He had shown me a lot about the truth and the love of God. And that was the case for many people. And it was undeniable. Like, you couldn't just turn around and say, like, oh, none of this was true, at least not at first. But over time, that actually really is what people did. People did end up becoming pretty nihilistic about it because he had been such a foundation for so many. People began to renounce their faith because when he fell, everything that they believed that was attached to their counting on him, because again, these were just teenagers, most of the people in my life at the time, as I was saying before, they're counting on a person, not just a principle. And so when that person fell, the principles began to fall with it. The very sort of statutes of their faith were just like, well, that didn't mean what I thought it did, and that didn't mean what I thought it did. And I mean, we've seen the fallout from that has been crazy. And so there were people I mentioned whose response to that, people who stayed in the church, whose response to that was a pretty familiar response, which is something like, well, if something like this causes you to fall, then maybe you didn't really have real faith in the first place. And I think that sounds reasonable at first, because obviously a stronger faith would be able to withstand even betrayal. But the misunderstanding there is that I think God actually designed it for us to count on each other. He didn't just design us to count on doctrines. Like, don't worry, I was never really trusting you. I was always just trusting the doctrines that you gave me. I don't think that's the design. I don't think that's what he made. Why he says to Peter, "You're going to be the rock on which the church is built." He doesn't say like the doctrines that I give you, which you will give down to other people. And of course, that is a part of it as well. But there's more. Those doctrines must be embodied, and that's the only way that they are passed down. They don't actually. Maybe this is scandalous to say, but they don't actually exist like simply objectively. They only exist in and through us. We are the body of Christ, who is living those out or not living those things out in the world. And if we are not, then maybe even more scandalously, they just become untrue. They just become doctrines that aren't true. So sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I think that's just apropos for this space that we're mainly hanging out in on the internet. That I hear something like things that John Vervaeke's kind of aiming at. I don't know if you've watched much of his stuff, but things with propositional versus like your perspectival experiences with truth or reality, like how this trying to connect this to consciousness and to relationality, like all these
truth.
Yes, like that is a real truth. That is a real reality. It's not just the only the proposition, which you could extrapolate down to the doctrines, and so I think this is one of those places where I feel like that crux, and why I feel so connected to this space, is because I feel like this point is where those things really seem to at least break apart. And I think because whenever it's like, well, my trust is in God, not this man. It's like, well, I did trust this man. My trust is, my belief in grace is an idea, not something that's embodied in relationship. My experience with the faithfulness of God is devoid from this relationship of fidelity in marriage or fidelity in a pastoral priestly role. And we intuit that that's not true. Right. But that I think because of the culture and the time, the postmodern nature of the disintegration, the modern to the postmodern of the atomization and then the disintegration of these things, just kind of being separated, being dissected as well. This is detached from this part of reality, and this is another part of and you can pull these things apart, and they don't make sense together. And
Yes. So you can end up with people who say, I trust God, but I just don't trust anyone else.
Yeah.
That really is an impossibility. Like it's possible to say. It's just not possible that can be true, because uh, because mediation is the means that he has given us to know him. And of course, I do think there's such a thing as a kind of more direct knowing of God, but it's still mediated. It's still in some sense not direct. It's mediated through your body. It's through your brains, through the nervous system of your, it's mediated in so many ways. And this is just, for whatever reason, this is what God loves. He loves these sort of stacked, organic, relational ways of knowing, participatory knowing. And so when we try to escape that to let's say the merely propositional, it breaks down. And if you don't think it breaks down, you will find out when
Whoa.
you're betrayed.
That's what we're thinking. Exactly. And that's exactly why I think that it's so apropos to that point, because betrayal is relational. It like we can keep coming back to, but but the betraying of the office, the betraying of the relationship, the betrayal of yourself, the betrayal to your beliefs, like all of them are, it seems it comes, and it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual impropriety. It can be, theft. It could be a type of verbal or spiritual abuses and physical, all those things.
Yeah.
To where that betrayal comes in. It just seems like this is the one where, for whatever reason, this scandal always comes up to the top. And why is it the thing that, like, yeah, they were always after our money anyways, and this guy embezzled, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to have the same effect. I could be wrong, but, and,
Yeah.
in the case of your experience, it's interesting because, I guess you knew your wife in high school. It sounds like I did too. We met in high school. And so, so that was just an aside, but, anyways, man, yeah, I don't know. This is a conversation that I've had in a sort of testimonial way, but not in like a substantive related to the church in a certain way, at least publicly, and in a way with the type of resonance that, again, was probably not going to be able to find locally for various reasons, to be able to talk about John Vervaeke's cognitive 4E,
Right.
4 P's of
Not with
no.
the random guy in the coffee shop.
So, yeah. So anyways, I'm much appreciated for that. And, and why, to have said that phrase, and then for you to have written that phrase about, but for the grace of God, I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm paying attention. And, um, and so I don't know, like, I guess what I'm feeling now is like, well, here we've aptly, or maybe not so aptly, laid out a very big critique of something, I think. And I don't know if you got to, because I can't recall, but is, obviously, like, well, what's the positive vision?
I know
you know,
that's that's the tension that I feel in this conversation, and even in writing what I wrote, is I think if what we're saying is true, and that people really do count on people, and that cynicism is not called for. You can't just say like, well, doctrine of total depravity, people are just going to fail you anyway. Jesus is the only one who doesn't fail you. And so, which, oh, by the way, is obvious. Like, Jesus is the only one who doesn't fail you. I don't mean to say that that isn't true, but it isn't true enough, because cynicism about all the rest of our relationships. For example, I bring up in there, and maybe this will be a good way of moving it to the sort of application stage. What we do with this is marriage itself, right? Like, there's a way of forming your doctrine of sin, which then says that it's actually not possible to make promises, because you don't have enough agency to say, I will or I won't. I do until death do us part. That's just not something that you can honestly do. And so I sort of say in the piece, well, then, why aren't there, if there are ministers out there who are unsurprised, unshocked by these sorts of scandals breaking out, then why don't they just go ahead and say in their wedding homily, no need to make promises to each other. You're going to break them anyway. We're just promise breakers. That's just who we are. That's just what we do. And then to go further and say, like, why, by the way, should we even be making promises? Should there be promises at a wedding? Because Christians apparently are people who believe so much in sin that we don't believe in promises. At least not between two humans. Only God keeps his promises, not us. So of course, I think when you take it to that extent, hopefully it sounds absurd. It sounds too cynical. It sounds going too far to no longer believe that promises are what makes and breaks us, but makes us, not just breaks us. It's what makes life worth living in a sense. It's what's formed your life, and it's what's formed my life. And even the rebuilding after breaking a promise can form it even stronger still. George MacDonald talks quite a lot about this. He uses an image of a man who steals a watch from another man. And he says, how can you make this right? You could throw the man in jail, but you don't get your watch back. Right. So that's not enough justice to make things right. Maybe the guy finds the watch, gets you back the watch, gives you the watch. Okay, you got your watch back, but it was still stolen from you. You've still been wronged. So even that doesn't make things fully right. He says, how could things be made fully right? And he says, well, even if you don't get the watch back, the way that things are made fully right is if the man gives you himself. If he comes to you and says, I was wrong. I know what I've done was wrong. How can I make it right with you? And so at that point, he says, he's given you more than your watch. That's his response. He's given you himself. So you've received more. The greater does more than the lesser, even if you don't get the watch back in the end. That's how God has made redemption. That, and Paul uses this language quite a bit. That's how good grace is. That in the end, we might even be able to say, despite the betrayals, it was worth it, because there's something even better on the other end of that thing. There is such a redemption that is better than what things originally were before they were broken. And so, I think that's part of it, that we should believe, one, that promises are worth keeping and are keepable.
Mm-hmm.
And then we should also not let Satan convince us that when we break promises, that actually is the only nature there is. We were never going to keep it in the first place, and we can't be promise keepers, right? It's just not possible. And people do this with themselves all the time with their struggle with pornography. Let's say they go 6 months and they don't look at it. They're just like, I'm done. Oh my gosh, I'm so free. And then one terrible night, because of this and that, they fall back into it and they look at it. And then what does Satan say to them in that moment? See, you never actually quit. You never actually renounced this thing. It still owns you. It always has owned you. And this is just that little bit of proof that you needed to show you that there was no such thing as quitting. But that's of course not true. All you did was, like, for a few seconds, like, fall back into something that for 6 months you had real progress in.
Yeah.
Progress is way more real than the 6 seconds.
Yeah. There's that got me thinking about sobriety. That got me thinking about, healing. And again, like, just a binary of like, oh, well, I sin or I don't sin. And, obviously we have a doctrine of sanctification, but it seems blurry. It seems very undefined. Like, what is it's just this life, and, more or less like headed in. No, like that is real. That life is a journey, and that's a real part of it. The other piece that you hit on about what is the grace, and this was to take it to that point where you said where Carl Lentz said something along the lines of, I didn't fall from grace, I fell into grace. And you kind of, I don't know if you took issue with that line a little bit. But there is a part of me that relates to that in a certain way, because one of my best friends, he's a pastor and minister in Memphis. We grew up together. And when I was actually headed to Symbolic World, we went down and I flew out, stayed at his house, and we flew out from there. We went out to dinner that night, and it was right when I mentioned this guy earlier, Aaron Ivey, who is a worship pastor, songwriter from a church down in Texas called Austin Stone, in the kind of Reformed Baptist circles, and kind of big deal. And he just was like, kind of like, distraught about it. I was like, Kevin, dude, like, oh, sorry. Hey, buddy, I love you. It's like I'm looking at you. I'm sitting across you. I'm like, hey, man, like, worship leader, guy, like, and I said, he doesn't realize this now. It doesn't feel like this now, but getting caught was grace in his life. Yeah. And I think that's, and I don't know if that's what Carl Lentz, like, I mean, I would look like that, and I would say that about my own self, that they're like, they're that it didn't go further than X. It didn't go longer than X. Like, what, I don't know, those types of things. and that this is an opportunity for grace to abound, not so that grace abound, like that I've sinned that grace may be, but that this is an opportunity for that, for something like the goodness of God and the goodness of love, hope, redemption, these flowery, hopeful words. It's not that in that moment you pat your own back and and it's like, oh, everything's gonna be roses. It's the opposite of that. But that through that, I mean, and you can look then to a cross of suffering, like the embodied nature of sin. You say, well, um, but there's
Oh,
hope there. But there's hope there. And so I don't know. Those are the things that come to my mind with some of what you're talking about there. And
yeah.
then
So
but the last to the last point of yeah, so I guess the positive vision forward, because then you also talked about uh marriage and relationship, and I do think that um there is, well, there's opportunity. Well, I'll say this. One of Jordan Peterson's most powerful quotes for me was like, "You want to know a prayer? I'll tell you a prayer." I don't know if he was talking to Sam Harris or not. He's like, "I'll tell you a prayer. Ask God what you've done wrong. You'll get an answer. You want to get an answer to prayer."
that's a
And,
great line.
and I just think that, oh, what should I do? What should I do? I mean, I even was asking my question. Unfortunately, and fortunately, I will just say, and I remember thinking this was impossible at a certain point, and I did think it was impossible because I didn't believe it. I did not trust. I didn't think that God was trustworthy, and I think that that's part of the thing too. Is um, you tell the truth. No, I can't tell the truth. To know, believe me, this is worth it. It is it. If you trust me, that it is worth it. I don't know. But I will say that somehow it's worth it.
No, that's yep. That's that's really good. Agreed. I think that gets me to my main point about grace, which is that grace is not something that lets you off. It's something that grace does have strings attached. Maybe
Mm,
that's the best way to put it. Uh, the strings attach you to God,
mm,
um, and so there's a oh gosh, I'm gonna forget his name now, but the great theologian who wrote about the idea of gifts in the ancient East, and the notion is that gifts are not no strings attached. Gifts then were not understood to be like, oh, I'm just giving this to you. It's free of charge. Here you go. Gifts were always given to invite and introduce relationship. And so the strings attached are there, but the strings attached are good if the giver is good. And so if we begin to see grace that way, then falling into grace is beautiful because you are falling into a relationship which you must stay in and which you must be true to, which forces you, like you said, even in getting caught, there's grace in that because it forces you to now be truthful about something which if you weren't, you'd just be stuck in slavery forever. The slavery of delusion and hiding uh, and secret shame and defeat and betrayal. But once you fall into grace, let's say to use his language, you have fallen into a relationship that will tie you down in some senses. It will tie you down to the truth, and it will tie you to him in a way that will make you faithful. And so, hopefully, that's what he means by it. And if so, I take no issue with it. But I see us using this notion of grace as something that kind of continually lets us be or lets us off. Um, it's forgiveness without transformation, which to me is something like the worst possible scenario.
is that antinomianism? Is that something
I
something that,
guess so. I mean, yeah, that would be attached to it. It's just the
yeah.
notion that there's no law.
And I will say, I mean, I I will give a final critique, and then I'm gonna give a maybe what was the positive, I had a positive vision on there. Well, because I can think of this critique to this point. I'll tell another story related because for better or for worse, these are conversations that I do have with people.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a guy who's a pastor around here where I live. And this is the point. Okay. I don't want to be bashful about this because this is pointing to one of the problems that we've been discussing.
Yeah.
And I guess he was giving whatever you want to call it, counsel to a couple where there had been infidelity of some sort. And he looked at me, the pastor looked at me in this conversation and he said, I just had to tell that wife that she just can't understand how sinful men are. Yeah, dude. And I said, I don't agree with that. That was then making it her fault. And
even if it wasn't making it her fault, it was making her
responsible. It was making her responsible for fixing the problem, which was you just can't. You need to forgive him because you just don't know how bad we are. So just and I just was like, so he has no responsibility. It's her responsibility to forgive because she just needs to get on board with understanding how bad men can be or something like that. And and again, it goes back to this idea that we're just so messed up. That's why we need Jesus, is because we're so messed up.
Yeah.
There is a ring of truth in there or something. There is, but there's also, like, if you leave it at that, which so many times it is, there is no responsibility. And I think that is obviously the big question of the evangelical, faith and works and all those types of things is that I think, without having said it explicitly, that our brothers from other historical traditions, brothers and sisters from other historical traditions and their theologians are helping us transform, even in these small conversations in this corner of the internet, that reality. And even, heretics like Jordan Peterson about taking personal responsibility that I think is lacking for the sake of a disembodied message, to put it.
Absolutely. I mean, agency is a really hard thing to talk about. And the Christian worldview, I think, gives us a really complex view of what agency is, because it isn't just us and God. It's also, powers and principalities moving in all kinds of different directions. But the notion that everything is just, 100% God and 0% us or something like that, that kind of temptation towards determinism that some of our Protestant tradition has been tempted towards, and maybe even Augustine was tempted towards when he was talking to Pelagius, though I don't think he goes there, and I don't think our Protestant tradition goes there, but it is tempted to go there, is that same kind of dangerous road, which is like, well, men are just going to do what men are going to do. Thankfully, God is good.
Yeah.
And that, at the very least, it doesn't work functionally. It's not common sense, that's for sure. Your decisions seem to really matter a lot.
They do.
But I would say it's also not the sense that the Bible is making of these things.
So I guess to kind of round this out, why I don't know why we hit on this earlier. I just felt like I needed to get that story out there, because it's important to like that is connected to the problems that we're talking about. But I guess the positive vision, to say, is the pithy things like hope. Like I want to give people hope, men, women out there, like, in a lot of ways. And I think that's even what Carl's trying to do. His podcast is called Lights On. Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it now. Like, unfortunately, but fortunately, that that with even that in the very thing that we're critiquing, there is also a way and a path of hope.
You're doing it.
Yes, sir. And that's what I'm trying to say. And that even because you mentioned earlier about building, uh, like building things, and this thing came crashing down. But I believe, and I think even for Carl, um, is that their family landed on the rock.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, did they build a house? Did I build a house on? I did not build a good house. I did not. Carl did not build a strong, integral house. But I think that we built it on top of something,
Mhm.
and so that even at the bottom, if you find Christ or you're in this situation, I heard my wife and I, we would listen to, other podcasts that were dealing with this question a lot during the hardest times. And they said one of the greatest things to know was that even at the bottom, it it's solid.
Yeah.
Um, and there I believe, and that was true for us, and we were able to rebuild on that and continue to. Um and so, that I just want to put that out there. And
Well
that's why
said. I mean, that's pretty much Paul's exact language, right? That we're building on the foundation of Jesus.
Mm,
Sometimes we're building with, wood and straw. Sometimes we're building with precious materials,
mm,
and it's all going to pass through the fire. And I don't think he just means one day. I think you've already passed through fire, and a lot of your wood and straw has, Lord willing, been burned away.
yeah.
You're learning how to, and so am I. We're both learning now. Hope now is purgatory. I think might be
Yes,
my take on it. At least
right, of
now
course. Yeah.
um, is we're learning to let reality burn away the things that will not stand on that foundation. And we'll have the foundation no matter what. He says some will just kind of like just make it through the fire because all they really have is the foundation of Christ.
Yeah.
And but I would hope that for those we count on, for our spiritual leaders, that they would be showing us more than just the foundation of Christ. If their only claim is I have this foundation and everything else is wood and straw, and all I do is continually build wood and straw on top of it, and I'll just squeak through the flames just like you will,
Mm,
then I think they're probably missing Paul's exhortation there. He's not saying, join me in squeaking through the flames. He's saying build something worthy, build something that is made of materials that will withstand the holiness of God, that will
mm,
not just withstand, but will be perfected by the holiness of God, as every precious material is in fire, purified. Um, and so that I think is the sort of positive view moving forward, which you're doing, with this podcast and all the and with your family as you rebuild it yourself. But it is to not become cynical, to not allow our wives and the women who are told lines like that one um, to feel like they need to alone, I don't know, bear the responsibility for our irresponsibility. But especially as men, I started the article by saying, I'm writing
yeah.
this especially for men,
Yeah.
uh, especially as men, to see that we have a calling, we have a purpose, there's enough reason and incentive there to be trustworthy. Um, if you know that you're needed, that other people are counting on you, and that God made you to build with good materials. And so that's not easy, not by
No,
any means, but
the
it's a
thing
different
that
struggle to struggle up the mountain than it is to
it is,
struggle whether or not you're even going to try to climb.
to me, it was kind of hitting around this theme of the patient kingdom. Your Substack, that idea of we want quick fixes to problems and to failures. We want to bypass them. We don't want to walk patiently through them because it's so much more difficult. And even me getting, even Carl, I mean, he didn't basically make a peep for 4 years.
Right. Right.
um
Which was wise.
yeah, for me getting, I mean, it was 7 years to get on here. So
Mm.
like and because I did have a public, I've traveled, and a website and an album and all, like these types of things as an identity, like um to get to this point, to have public conversations, to have a public of something. whatever you want to call it, ministry, podcast,
Yeah.
conversation, but it's like it was a 7-year process for me. And so,
That patience is really important.
yeah, and that I mean, even I even turned people like at my church, people were like, "Hey, when are you gonna come back?" Even the pastors were like, "Hey, we want to come like help this X, Y, and Z." I was like, "Man, dude, I am not ready." Like I even had a therapist who was pushing me one time, and I was like, "Dude, there's so much trauma for me to be a part of a worship team or any like the whole thing at the church I was at for almost 2 decades." Like it was like that's that kind of again I that's those were the kind of things that made me kind of be like, there's a disconnect between uh understanding, like I could just feel so acutely the for myself, like me going and embodying this place and certain things, and this is like it just feels as off limits still. And nobody was imposing that but myself.
Yeah.
And I think because there is I guess a low view of certain things for our liturgies and our worships and all that kind of stuff. So
And roll.
yeah. So
Thank
anyways,
the
man.
Lord. I mean, that was the grace of God working in you I think, to make you patient enough to rebuild slowly, which is, I think, the only wise way to rebuild.
Yeah. 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 Three little pigs in there somewhere. But like
That's right.
anyways, to bring it to some levity. I don't know if there was anything else you were maybe considering that we haven't like hit on today.
I
Anything? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to encourage you. I think it's, in my own community, I've seen a lot of infidelity, and on all levels, right? I mean, all of us are unfaithful, um, on different levels, but on the level that we've been talking about today, I've seen a lot of it on that scale, and or at least more than I'd like. And it's refreshing, because I tend to, maybe you could tell from the article that I tend to be the sort of person that's not uh, all like let's bring the restoration as quickly as possible. Forgiveness. I think it was clear enough in my article that I'm one of those annoying people that thinks that those things should happen more slowly. Because there is a lot of temptation in moments like that. With the guy when I was 18 years old, there were a lot of people that really wanted to see restoration happen very quickly, because God is unconditionally loving and forgiving, and so why shouldn't we be? And that the direct application of that appears to be, well, then let's make full restoration. And by the way, if it, why would his wife not also want to make full restoration right away? Because if God is unconditionally loving and forgiving, then shouldn't everybody else be? And if they aren't, that must be an imperfection on their part.
Ah,
Um,
yeah.
and I have been a kind of stubborn voice that says that that's not exactly how restoration works. It's not how repentance works. Um, it's not how forgiveness works most of the time. Sometimes, but most of the time, if you think about, sorry, I don't mean to bring us on another tangent. I was
No,
meaning to
we can go there, man. Like I've got
conclude, but
fire.
if you think about what it means to apologize and be forgiven, if all you did was bump into someone, then you could say, "I'm sorry that I bumped into you," and they could say, "You're forgiven," I guess. Um, but if the interaction between the two of you is really any deeper than that, then an immediate apology takes for granted that you and the victim already both know the entire extent to which you have wronged them in that moment where you're saying what you're saying. And that's just simply not true. And so there's one way of understanding this 70 times 7 as not just being 70 different sins, um, but as being how many times you have to forgive the same person for the one thing. And
Mm.
not simply because you fail to be someone who forgives, but because 6 months in, you're going to realize some new consequence or some new depth of the thing that has happened that you didn't realize before because you were just picking up the pieces of the most obvious parts of what has happened. And now you're realizing, oh my gosh, it's this too. I'm walking through this with a friend of mine now who is maybe, let's say, a slightly more rare case where it's the male um, who is the one recovering. And um, it is years into it, you're still discovering new ways to forgive because you're still discovering new ways that it hurts, new ways that you were wronged, even because nobody has the capacity to take all that in at once. And so that it absolutely must be a patient process.
Yes.
And so if you are the one apologizing, if you are the one repenting, then you have to know if you say, with all the passion of your being, the day after you were caught, or the week after you were caught, or the month after you were caught, I have never felt so sorry for anything in my life. I will do anything. I'm so sorry, with tears in your eyes. Would you forgive me? If you go on to say, would you forgive me? It's still almost unfair. It's unfair, even at that point, to ask a question like that, to set the other person up, to say something like yes, as though that yes were some kind of like permanent and exhaustive level of forgiveness for levels of a sin to which they have not even felt yet.
Yeah. And then they feel shame for not being able to forgive somebody. Forgive as I have forgiven. And I think to that point, one thing that I felt early on was that I caused it was like, okay, so this marriage is like a car wreck, right? Complete, like, and that there was a massive wound and it's going to take like 6 months, it's and right now it's complete, we're in the ICU. We're in, uh, and we're on life support. And then, then there's rehab, and then and then you maybe have to do like change the dressing for these wounds at home or something. And then, and every time it's a reminder. And oh, by the way, along the way, there's things that happen that maybe even like hit that wound like a new revelation or something.
Yeah.
And and then we're talking about some trite form of like, can't you just say you forgive him? Like what the hell does that even mean?
Yeah.
Like, and can't you get on board with the program so we don't have to look at this? I want to use expletives right now, but so we don't have to look at this ugly thing,
Yeah.
so we can pretend it's not as bad as it really is so that everyone can feel better about them. Like, that's what I think is a big problem too. And I mentioned this in the introduction, is that we want to get past looking at this. We don't want to deal with the shit. Like, we don't want to deal with it as a church, as a community. Like, we don't want to look at it. So let's just say you're forgiven, their marriage is reconciled, and move on so that we can just go about our lives.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a part of the
Moving things
problem, but
forward that way.
and that, um and then everyone's living in a delusion at that point. You're forcing the marriage to exist within a delusion. You're relating to this person as if nothing really bad even happened. Like,
Yeah.
um, you know, so you took a,
And then if you want to take that a couple steps further, in cases with high profile spiritual leaders, the car crash has a million victims.
yeah. And
There are different levels.
how do you fix that? Like, he can't, there's no possible way for him to have that conversation with everybody.
No, there's not. And so, but but once you say there's no possible way to have that conversation with everyone, then that isn't just one, that is a statement of mercy towards him in some ways. It's like, okay, you can't have a million conversations.
Well, I guess he
True.
can't by having a podcast.
Yeah, that's also true. Very true.
Yeah.
But it should also make us take a step back and be like, okay, we need to be careful about the roles that we put people in and the roles that we assume, because we're driving a car that can injure 1 million people at once. Not everybody drives a car like that. But if you are, you need to make sure that you're the best possible driver. Maybe better image would be like an airplane pilot, driving
Yeah.
a whole lot of people around in the air. If
Yeah.
you're gonna build a plane that can fit 1 million people in it, then maybe I'm exaggerating with 1 million, but the numbers are pretty high for someone like Carl Lentz.
Yeah.
Then you better be a trustworthy pilot. And so I mean that's part of it, but there are other elements to forgiveness just to make it even more complex, which is that for the other person, for the person who's forgiving, someone like you and me and Carl Lentz, whatever level it might be, there are levels of forgiveness that say this wrong that was done to me, I let it pass. I forgive you. But then there are other levels that are something more like excusing, where you actually learn, like, this person is also not just the monster that they were to me. They had the parents that they had, and the difficulties that they had, and all of those things, which sometimes you can use, or let's say the perpetrator could use as an excuse, right? Oh, I went to therapy and I figured out it was all my father's fault. Thanks for that. I'm glad that that makes the victim feel a lot better. But eventually the victim does need to some degree forgive not just what you have done, but almost, to me, I think if you see that it's not just the perpetrator, but the perpetrator's parents and everyone that was ever around them and everything that ever happened to them, and you keep kind of scaling that back, eventually there's something like forgiving reality itself, just like forgiving God, almost, not because God has done anything wrong, but because because it's hard to not be frustrated with him too.
Yeah.
In almost any of these kinds of occasions. And so anyway, that's how many levels to forgiveness there are.
Yeah, there
thinking.
are.
That's why it takes patience.
And I think that a lot of these words that we use, forgiveness, repentance, reconciliation, they kind of all get like lumped into this fuzzy thing that's hard to like. We don't have great, again, like clear categories or clear pathways for what, and sometimes you can then get so legalistic that you don't, well, the person did the steps and so it's fine, or well, maybe it's not even then. But this idea that, like for certain situations and for people that are victims or situations, it's like reconciliation in this life is probably not possible. Forgiveness is always possible. But forgiveness is also not a thing that happens in an instant. It can be, but it's probably a process of days, months, weeks, and years, and forgiving again and again, and so I think that those are just not things, again, that I feel like people have the patience for, so they would rather just minimize it and move on, and it's a weird deal being like, no, you need to take this or me more seriously, what I did more seriously. Like I'm looking for that. I'm actually longing for that. Not because I'm somebody special, but because fidelity is special, because God is special, like because marriage is special, and all those, um, and so those are all parts of that. And I think that you gave that interesting, illustration between the scale of repercussion related to what you've built, and just to go back, this something I said earlier, it's easy to critique like modern mega church or mega ministry culture and stuff, but the list just continues to go on, and we can go back to Tim Keller. I don't want to get too wild and crazy on here, but I'm going to. Megan Basham's book that I'm sure you saw some of that maybe floating around about the
I saw it floating around. That's about it. That's
all
about
the was it sheep's for or shepherds for sale. I watched years ago I say years, probably 3 or 4, 5 years ago, a conversation with J.D. Greer, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention at the time, pastor of a big mega church out close to where you're at. And he had on Tim Keller for a conversation. And he was asking Tim Keller how he gets out, how you write all these books. How, he's like, and Tim kind of scolded him and scolded all the young bucks trying to, he said, I preached for 30 years. And then, I just put what I preached into books, and it wasn't that hard.
Did it first. Yeah.
And
such a good answer.
Yeah. And
Keller.
And then I also listened to him because here you and me are talking about Protestants and Reformed people and folks, so it's like, okay, so within that world, is there anything like, all right, there's this dude. He's not a dude. There's this man. And, I'm a dude with my backwards hat and you're a dude with your surfboard. But like,
true.
And someone asked him, it may have even been in that same interview session and people, and I think even in that book, there was big critiques of, him and whatever, some other things, but someone said, what was helpful to you? And he said, he said the biggest thing had nothing to do with his success. It had everything. He said the biggest practice in my life was reading through the Psalms, continually reading through the Psalms. That's what I did every day as I started. And I was like, wow, okay. Yep. And so, God willing, we can say that he was a faithful man, God willing, because that's also our point is like, we should be able to look at people and say, I think that he ran the race well.
Yeah.
And other people haven't, and so, but not everybody's not. That's the cynic, that nobody's running the race well, something. So,
yeah. Well done, good and faithful servant. I don't think that's just an imputation, right? Like, I don't think he's just talking to Christ when he says that. I don't think he loves us. It's getting a little theological, but I don't think he loves us just by looking at Christ. I think Christ's love is better than that. Christ's love is so good that he makes us distinctively lovable by loving us well. He doesn't just make us copies of him. He makes us hopefully versions of him that are not him, but are our true selves. So that when he looks at me, of course, I hope he sees Christ, but I hope he sees Christ in me. And that there was something in me that was well done. Otherwise, what are we doing with this whole love thing, right? If I say to my wife, I love you, not because of anything that you've done. In fact, despite most of what you've done for your entire life, I love you not because of who you are, but because of who I am. That's the way that we speak of God's love, but it doesn't sound so good when you say it to each other. It doesn't sound like the kind of love you would really long for. Hopefully, at the end of the day, I can also say, though of course I accept her and her imperfections, and she accepts me. I could also say, I love you because of your particular beauty and the way that you speak, your voice, the way that you teach our kids and have raised them, your particular style of walking and talking and laughing and crying. That's what I hope that God's love is doing to us, not just sort of laser beaming us with his love, but making us into faithful people. That's what this whole conversation has been about for me. Is I think grace transforms us into the people we were meant to be, so that God can say to us in the end, "Well done, good and faithful servant."
Right,
and it will be true. It won't just be some kind of legal fiction. It will be actually true of you and of me.
Not just some legal fiction. I like it, dude. Well, thanks for having this heavy and weighty conversation with me today.
It's been a pleasure.
All right, man. We'll end this thing backstage. Stick around.
All right.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.